Good morning, Rabbi. I have a question for you.
Yes, ma'am.
How are you? First of all,
How are you?
I'm good, thank you. I tried to find a recording for last week. Do you know if there was one made?
Ron, do we have a recording from last week's service?
Yeah, it would have been on the website, and it probably would have been on YouTube also.
Oh,
Can you-
okay.
Ron, can you find the link from the website to the archives page or to the, and then put it in the chat for us?
That would be great. Thank you.
Hello, very sparkly today. I like your bling. What's that? Sparkly up there.
And I just put the YouTube link from last week's in the chat.
Fabulous, thank you.
You're welcome.
Lois, you see it there?
Just
We
yes,
are now
thank
live,
you.
Dan.
Thank you.
Yes. All right, friends. Let's see. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm glad everybody's here. Those who are joining us from home, hello, hello. And those who are here with us, hello, hello. It's wonderful to see you all. A few announcements. This coming Sunday, April the 14th, after you finish your tax return, which is due on the 15th, at 3 p.m., we're going to have a fantastic concert here at the temple called There Can Be Miracles. And this is a beautiful concert that's going to have all of the Temple Bethel singing groups participating. Our children's choirs, our adult choirs, some fabulous individual performances. It's going to be really, really, really fun. And guess what it costs to go? Nothing. Just your time and your enthusiasm. So the musical selections will range from Broadway to pop and rock and roll. Should be a really great, great show. So that's going to be Sunday the 14th at 3 p.m. The following Sunday, Brotherhood is hosting a pre-Passover brunch at 10 a.m. here at the Schaefer campus, where we're going to be enjoying a conversation with Dr. Samuel Edelman, who is the Executive Director and CEO of the Center for Academic Engagement of the Israel on Campus Coalition. And he'll have an opportunity to talk a little bit about what students are facing on college campuses and how they can be effective and safe advocates for Zionism and for the state of Israel in these difficult environment. You can register on the website. So that's Sunday, April 21st at 10 a.m. Brotherhood is sponsoring that. We encourage you to join us second night Seder with Billy Joel Shtick will be Tuesday, April 23rd at 5:30 p.m. So we encourage you to join Lori and me with a delicious dinner with artisan foods, which you don't have to cook and you don't have to clean, which improves the stock of that Seder by at least 5 points, if not more. And Sisterhood on Thursday, April 25th, will be hosting the Women's Passover Experience at 7 p.m. will be a wonderful interview with Bracha Horowitz, who is an author and activist. She has an amazing story to tell about her advocacy for her special needs child and how she navigated some other challenges in her life. It's going to be a beautiful experience. Talk about personal liberation. We hope that you'll sign up for that. And other things that you can enjoy on our website, tdeboca.org. And what do we have for lunch? Judith, what'd you bring?
Chocolate chip cookies.
Chocolate chip cookies is a big winner already from the start. I'm not sure those are the cookies I would bring to try to win Famous Amos. I'm not sure is necessarily the greatest, and as someone who knows chocolate chip cookies well, but the fact that you are bringing the cookies is already a very, very good start.
Share them because they've been in the bag.
Oh, okay.
But anybody would like it, chocolate.
Very good. You guys have nothing. It's pathetic. What do we have over here?
Oh, this isn't as good as chocolate cookies.
She already concedes. Okay. She's conceding the chocolate chip cookies because
It's
you.
just like I don't know, cheese and tomato. and-
Cheese and tomato, doesn't look like there's any bread there, or, you know. Nuts to you, just kidding, because she has a bag full of nuts. Susan had a wonderful lunch already, which she was describing, which had almond butter and peanut butter and multigrain bread and
And sliced bananas,
sliced bananas, and then there were raisins,
raisins and cinnamon.
which is a great lunch, which she ate before she came. So do we give her credit for that or not?
Yes.
Okay, you get credit, because it's too messy to bring. Any other lunches here? What do you have in the grapes? Okay, and Steve, what do you have?
Chicken with pesto, balsamic glaze on some fancy bread with nuts and cranberries.
So far, that's our winner. Sorry, as good as the cookies are. Yeah, what do you have?
I'm gonna show you.
We
I
have,
brought it with me. That's it.
she brought a picture of a steak mushroom noodle stir fry, which apparently I'm supposed to cook her for lunch today.
I already had something, but you said you wanted.
I'm very impressed. Okay, anybody at home having a good lunch? Lois, anything good? No,
Not
right?
yet, not yet.
All
I'm
right,
eating
well,
leftovers from company in a little bit.
and the Stanley Cup, I think you win. Okay, very good. All right, yes,
How does the people in for lunch bring everybody in something?
there we go. Now we're talking. Now we're talking. All right, we're gonna get back into our friend Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. How many of you had fun last week and that's why you came back this week? All the other people didn't even come
We have
back.
questions.
Do we want to talk about the people who didn't want to come back? Do we have anything we need to say about, no, there's a couple I know who are at doctor's appointments. Okay, so we spent a lot of time last week talking about Dr. Heschel and talking about Hasidism and talking about Wissenschaft des Judentums, right, which is just fun to say, right? The scientific study of Judaism and this incredible mix that went into the thought and the belief system of Dr. Heschel, coming from Hasidic roots and then into the sort of secular, scientifically, rationally oriented world of the academia of Germany in the 1930s. And he was literally, as he said in his own words, plucked from the fire by Julian Morgenstern of the Hebrew Union College, along with 25 other remarkable scholars who were rescued from the Nazis, where he was brought to Cincinnati to teach at the Hebrew Union College for 5 years, and then made his way to the Jewish Theological Seminary, where he taught for the rest of his life, and how his thought led him into a very significant period of social activism in the 1960s, surrounding first Vatican II and the outreach of the Catholic Church to modernize its relationship with the Jewish community. He was at the forefront of those conversations, plus his activism within the civil rights movement, his friendship with Dr. Martin Luther King, and also his opposition to the war in Vietnam until his death in 1972. Today, we're going to talk about the prophets and a little bit about the belief system that informs his thinking on the prophets. And then next week, we're going to spend time talking about two of the prophets in particular, Amos and Hosea. We may get into a little bit of Isaiah too, but we'll see how far we get. We'll see if we can get done all the things that I had intended to do today, which may or may not happen. Okay, so this is typically the way people think about God and their theology. If you look at this hastily drawn diagram by your infinitely talented rabbi, what does this say to you about the relationship we often think of with God and our theology?
We're very small and God is very.
We're very small and God is very big. Good. What else?
It's reciprocal.
It's reciprocal. Okay, there is a relationship that goes back and forth between them. Good. What else?
It's the eclipse.
It's the eclipse. She said it was the eclipse. I have nothing to say about that. That's great. What else?
God is singular, we're multiple.
Okay, God is singular and we're multiple. Good. Good. And there is this sense that we're over here and God is out there, right? And the mission is to try to figure out, how do you bridge the chasm, right? How do we get from where we are in our mortal, physical world to the transcendent realm in which God dwells apart from us. How many of you grew up with this kind of a theology?
Yeah, every little thing does.
How many of you still think of this as your theology? Right? So when you think about your theology, right, in whatever way you construct it, how many of you have ever been significantly angry at the Holy One for acting upon you in a way that didn't feel just? Sure, right? And how many of you ever had a moment where you reached out from beyond your own experience, right, to try to get God to do something for you? How many of you ever put your head down and said, "Oh God, please"?
Yeah.
Right?
We've all done that.
Okay, right? I remember Ari was running for a nifty office when he was in high school. And I remember being there and just sort of quietly like, come on, right? Didn't do anything. But the idea is that there's a God out there, right? That can do things to help us here. But that there's this binary relationship. And sometimes that God is unreachable. The chasm is too wide and we feel kind of lost and alone. Has anyone ever had an experience where you just sort of felt like, you know what, I think I'm alone in the universe? Even if there's millions of people around, right? I'm not even sure there is a God, and if there is a God, it's not here. So this is not how Heschel was raised to look at the world. This is how Heschel was raised to look at the world. What's the difference?
Part of God.
You are a part of God. What else?
God is in us.
God is in us,
We're in God.
and we're in God. So there's still that dialectic, right? There's still that relational thing. It's just the locus is different. Instead of thinking that God is out there and I'm over here,
Get it together.
God is everything and everywhere all around. You just have to open your eyes and see. So, what was the greatest spiritual experience that humanity encountered in the 20th century? All of you were alive for it.
Like going to the moon.
Going to the moon. Apollo 8, which was around Christmas time and New Year's time
1960.
of 1968.
69.
68.
Oh, yeah.
Christmas time of 68. Apollo 8.
Oh, it was 69.
Trust me.
That's when
They landed on the moon in July of 69. This was 6 months
Right.
before that.
Okay.
Okay?
69.
It was the very first time humanity had ever seen their whole planet from a distance. And they had, before that, and we take for granted that we have seen that little blue dot in that sea of black space, right? Because we've all lived with that image for 55 years. But it's only been 55 years in the entirety of human history that we were able to actually see our planet from a distance. That amazing picture that Jim Lovell took aboard Apollo 8 in December of 1968. What Carl Sagan, the famous astronomer, right, talked about that little blue dot. And what did that do for people to see the world in that way?
We're just a dot in the cosmos. I mean, it really puts us in our place.
It was a bit of a humbling thing, right? Jim Lovell wrote in his autobiography later that it was the most humbling thing he had ever experienced in his life. Because from space, from that distance, you actually can't see the border between Gaza and Israel. You can't see any of the international borders about which we are spilling gallons of blood. And the idea of the unity of the world comes into very clear focus from that distance. But ultimately, right, we live in this world and we think God is somewhere out there. And the idea, what Heschel was saying is, no, God is here. And why does that matter? It matters because of the way that Heschel considers his theology, which he talks about as a theology of pathos. So when you hear that word pathos, what does that mean?
Feeling compassion.
Feeling, compassion, right? The idea that everything that happens in the universe happens to God. Which is a very different way of thinking about theology. If you remember this famous story of Elijah and the prophets of Baal, when he goes to battle against Queen Jezebel, right? And King Ahab, and he says, fine, you want to see who's the real God? Let's figure out who the real God is. I'm going to tell you. You take your sacrifice and I'll take mine, right? And they put their sacrifice, and the 450 prophets of Baal are dancing around. Come on, Baal, we love Baal, let's go, Baal, right? They're flaying themselves and they're cutting themselves and they're screaming and yelling, oh God, right? And that's not what happens. Elijah calls out to God, right? And God consumes the sacrifice. But while the prophets of Baal are going at it, Elijah starts engaging in some prophetic biblical trash talk. He says to them, hey, why isn't your God responding? Maybe you gotta yell a little louder, right? Maybe your God is sleeping and you gotta wake him up. Or maybe your God's in the bathroom. And they kept going. Of course, nothing happened, right? So this idea that God needs to be awakened or somehow made to take notice of our experience, that God is typically oblivious to human experience, to Heschel was completely wrong. And what he said was that the fact is that God is constantly involved and affected by the doings of humankind. And the fact that we don't get that is why we sin. How many of you have ever hurt someone's feelings by accident? How did that happen?
You don't know all the details or something.
Ignorance.
To the situation.
Right.
Yeah. How many of you hurt somebody's feelings on purpose? All right, well, that you can take up with your therapist. But most of us, when we hurt other people, it's because we're oblivious. We're not thinking about their experience. There was a young couple who had a baby last week, and the family's gone through a lot in the last few months. And the grandmother of this baby, the mother of the mother, right, has been sort of latching on to the birth of this baby as something that's carried her through some very difficult stuff. And so when the baby was born, for whatever reason, they said, we just need time alone, us and our baby. We'll let you in a couple of days. Or after the weekend, or whatever it was, right? And they caused a lot of hurt inadvertently. And when they sat down and said, listen, I just need to let you know, like, what happened while you guys were in the hospital was really painful. You shut me out. Like, that was hurtful. They didn't do it to hurt her. It was like they didn't think about her. They were thinking about themselves. And they were thinking about how excited they were to bring their baby into their household, and they weren't thinking about all the other people who were also excited about this baby. It wasn't that they were being mean, they were just not thinking. They were not aware of the pathos, of the feelings of other people outside their little orbit. And generally speaking, when we sin, it's because we're not thinking. Very seldom do we sin deliberate. Right? Because we want to stick it to somebody, or we think we want to, right? Most of the time it's because we're oblivious. We made a mistake. We weren't thinking. And so Heschel's point is, if we were actually convinced that God felt everything that we did, we would probably be a little more careful with how we behave. And so his understanding of prophecy is when somebody is so in tune with what God is feeling that they can't bear it, they have to channel it and express it. So when you think about what it means to be a prophet, what do you think it is to be a prophet? Yeah,
Well, I've tried to read his book, and I felt like the vision had to do with these prophets. They're seeing all the bad in the world, and they're looking at mankind and all the way their behavior is, and they want to change it or bring it back to God, or I mean, it's like they see everything, or they think they do. And they want to change the behavior of mankind.
right. They see how humankind is behaving, and they find it so deeply and painfully offensive, they can't not shout about it. Okay, but they're not shouting for their own shout. They feel like they are channeling God's anguish at what humankind is doing. But when you think about what a prophet is, before you walked in the room, right? When you think, what's a prophet? What's a prophet? What do prophets do?
They foresee the future.
They foresee the future, okay? And how are they able to do that?
They have a connection with God.
They have a connection with God, so they're able to foretell the future, because God knows the future. Okay, good. What else? So prophets predict the future. What else do prophets do?
I think they tell truth to power.
They tell truth to power, right? They say the truth that people may not necessarily want to hear, right? Because it has to be said.
And they're not coming from necessarily an elevated position, like they might be a shepherd talking to a king or talking to someone higher, what we think of as sociologically higher than that. Although I guess maybe shepherds could have been very wealthy back then because.
Depends on the shepherd, right? Okay.
Oh,
So how do prophets, if prophets are the people that speak truth to power, where do they get the truth from? How do they know that what they're proffering is true?
They say they feel that have a message from God,
They feel
from a higher spirit.
Okay, so they feel like they get a message from God. Okay, and how do they get that message? Is it a telegram? Is it an email?
Depends on the prophet.
Depends on the prophet. Okay, say more about that.
Well, there were a few who spoke to God. But most of the prophecy came through dreams.
Okay, so maybe it's through a dream or a vision, right? Moses, who is the prophet of prophets, right? Spoke to God panim el panim, right? Face to face. Pale pale, right? They kibitzed, right? They had, dialogue like we have dialogue. That's the level of intimacy they had. Most prophets don't have that. They have visions, okay? So, right, you have this idea that a prophet somehow is privy to revelation. Does a prophet try out for the job?
No.
Does, when they're in their last year of college, do they say, I could be an engineer, I could be an accountant, I think I'm gonna aim for prophecy?
No.
Why not?
It has to come from within. It has to come from within or without, right? And they can't themselves decide they're a prophet or they're a false prophet.
Right, so prophets don't try out for the job, and those that say, I think I wanna be a prophet, and often tend to offer false prophecy. Okay, yeah?
Also, if somebody is supposedly a prophet, I think you can't be a prophet unless somebody thinks you are.
That's right.
Correct. I don't know how I can say this right, because if you say you're having the weight of God or something, they have to be able to believe that that's what it is, because you have no way to prove that that's what happened.
Okay, so sometimes it is that people say, I have something to say, and this is what God revealed to me, and other people say, yeah, right. Right, and oftentimes it's only after that person is gone, that you actually realize that they were somewhat prophetic. There's actually, I don't know how many of you subscribe to Barry Weiss's Substack, The Free Press, but she has a series that she puts out, I think it's on Fridays or Sundays, called The Prophets, which I sort of like raised an eyebrow to because I was preparing for this class. And what she's highlighting is people who had truths long before their time, who had something to say, and then like 50 years later, you kind of realize, oh, actually, that person who was ignored actually knew what she was talking about. So Heschel thinks about prophecy in a similar but slightly different way. So I'm going to come back to these maps in a moment, but this is what Heschel says is to be a prophet. What is the essence of being a prophet? A prophet is a person who holds God and men in one thought at all times. You have to, again, forgive Heschel his gendered language, that's his time. I'm sure with almost utter certainty, if Heschel lived in politically correct times, he would make his language more gender sensitive. I don't think he thought of God in a gendered fashion. And when he talks about men, I think he's talking about humankind. So if you can get over that speed bump. Our tragedy begins with the segregation of God, with the bifurcation of the secular and the sacred. What does he mean by that? Where does the tragedy begin? There.
Separation.
This, he thinks, is tragic. Because this is actually the way he thinks the world looks. We worry more about the purity of dogma than about the integrity of love. We think of God in the past tense and refuse to realize that God is always present and never past. That God may be more intimately present in slums than in mansions, with those who are smarting under the abuse of the callous. So, when you take a look at the imposition of human suffering, or the existence of human suffering to which humanity is generally oblivious, where does that come from?
From yourself. That man is oblivious, you say?
Yeah,
Well,
I
I
think
think
it's something
people are
to do
so
with
busy
power.
just living.
say more about power.
Yeah, I'd say, as an example, people that are presenting themselves as leaders or prophets or whatever, surround themselves with palaces, or, for instance, the Pope, instead of living in a slum, is living in the Vatican. So,
Which is interesting because with this particular pope, he bristled at that. And in fact, he doesn't actually inhabit the papal apartment. Benedict does. He let Benedict remain in the papal apartment, and he lives in a smaller quarters. He had a hard time with that. But I think that there is, right, that separation. How many of you remember, right, when there was famine in Ethiopia and people would go around trick-or-treating with little coins for UNICEF? Because the idea that you could be callous to the starvation of little children in sub-Saharan Africa was considered ridiculous. So I remember as a little kid being given at school a tin can for UNICEF.
Right.
Yeah. And the idea was, if you're going to engage in a night of gluttony, right, going from house to house and collecting more candy than we could carry, these kids today, bunch of wimps, can't even walk through a whole neighborhood. We would walk miles with pounds of candy, right? Because, we could. They were like, you would say, This was the thing, you'd say trick or treat for UNICEF. And the expectation of our neighbors was that in addition to throwing a Kit Kat in our bag, they would also put a quarter in the push key.
If you were lucky, usually it was a penny or.
Right, or whatever, a few coins, and the idea is you bring back your can, and that would, right, because the idea is you can't be oblivious to that, but the fact is, most people are generally oblivious to that. And to Heschel, the fact was, you couldn't be oblivious to that. Not if you were, right, engaged in prophecy. The prophets were able to say, what does it feel to be me? And what does it feel to be God at the same time? What does it feel like to feel everything there is to feel in the universe all at once? Yeah.
The last sentence, God may be more intimately present in slums than in mansions. With those who are smarting under the abuse of talents. So why would we think that God would be more present when people are suffering?
Because that is typically,
I don't understand that.
because typically in the biblical mind, if God was present, you should be blessed and therefore prosper. And if you are suffering, there is this idea of God's absence. If God weren't absent, I wouldn't be suffering.
Yes.
So what he's proposing, which the prophets were able to say is, hey, the reason why those people are suffering isn't because God abandoned them or doesn't care about them, it's because humanity has abandoned them and doesn't care about them. So going further, what Heschel wrote is authentic utterance, meaning someone who is really speaking for God, derives from a moment of identification of a person and a word. Its significance depends upon the urgency and magnitude of its theme. So, for example, right, there's been horrible challenges and discord in sub-Saharan Africa and in Darfur in the Sudan for decades. And then in the midst of terrible civil war and horrible persecution, people were literally eating dirt. And the world caught sight of that, and all of a sudden, how many of you remember 20 years ago when the cause of Darfur and the famine there and the civil war in the Sudan took on international consciousness, right? Somehow the urgency and magnitude of that crisis took root in our consciousness. You could say the same for back in the 80s when there was a similar famine in sub-Saharan Africa. And Bob Geldof, who was a musician and a music producer, said, I can't bear it anymore. And the only way I can think of to make a difference is to get all of my musical friends to put on a concert in the UK and in America, and we're going to raise $1 billion. When $1 billion meant something. And he did. How many of you remember Live Aid in the 1980s?
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And any band that was any band was performing. And if you were not performing, you weren't anybody. All right, there were similar efforts, right? Bob Geldof, who no one would have thought of as being a prophet, couldn't take it anymore. And he decided, I need to lift up the voice of these people because they're starving to death. And the world doesn't seem to care. So I'm going to use what I know how to do and shine a spotlight on them and guilt the world into doing something. And they did. For a time. Right? So, going forward, the prophet's theme is, first of all, the very life of a whole people. And his identification lasts more than a moment. Right? Bob Geldof had a moment of epiphany But how many of you have ever had an epiphany and then you went back to bed? Right? You woke up at 3 a.m. with the aha. I figured something out. I had a flash of insight. And then, Bob yelled up and go back to bed. Can anyone think of another modern day prophet who had a flash of insight and didn't go to bed for 3 days? Theodore Herzl. Theodore Herzl is standing outside the trial of Captain Alfred Dreyfus, who was getting railroaded for sedition when he was clearly being framed. And they're screaming outside the courthouse, death to the Jews, death to the Jews. And Herzl realizes that the whole project of modernity in Europe is never going to work. The only way they're going to stop hating the Jews is if we get out of here and form our own country. And he sat in his apartment for 3 days. I don't think he ate. And he wrote Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state, his first pamphlet, which launched him on a 7-year journey of Zionism until he died literally of either syphilis or exhaustion or some combination thereof. They don't talk about the syphilis. But either way, right? This moment propels past the moment. He is one not only with what he says, he is involved with what his people in what his words foreshadow. This is the secret of a prophet's style. His life and soul are at stake in what he says and in what is going to happen to what he says. It is an involvement that echoes on. What is more, both theme and identification are seen in 3 dimensions. Not only the prophet and the people, but God himself is involved in what the words convey. The problem he's looking at is a problem that is actually a real problem that affects real people, but it's not just people. It's God that's being impacted by the injustices that are being visited upon people.
Excuse me, but what I'm hearing, or what I'm taking in here, is that there's a prophet in all of us.
The potential for prophecy could exist in all of us if we are called and sufficiently open to inhabiting that kind of a wavelength. So he says the prophet is a person, not a microphone. It's an actual individual. He is endowed with a mission, with the power of a word not his own, that accounts for his greatness, but also with temperament, concern, character, and individuality. The word of God reverberated in the voice of man. So the person is a real person, but also a vessel through which God's care and concern can enter into the world. Someone want to read this next part?
I will.
Go ahead.
To a person endowed with prophetic sight, everyone else appears blind. To a person whose ear perceives God's voice, everyone else appears dead.
Yeah.
Deaf. No one is just. This is no
knowing.
No knowing is strong enough. No trust complete enough. The prophet hates the approximate. He shows the middle of the road. People must have the summit to avoid the abyss. There is nothing to hold except God. Carried away by the challenge, the demand to straighten out man's ways. The prophet is strange,
One-sided.
one side, an unbearable extremist. I think it's hard to read.
Okay, so to a person that sort of has this prophetic experience, what's going on in the world is so obvious they can't understand why everybody else doesn't see it. What's the matter with you? You all blind? Don't you see what's happening? To a person whose ear perceives God's voice, everybody else is deaf. No one is just. No one knows, prophets are not moderates. Right? They're extremists. Because they have a truth, and it is a truth that they must promulgate with every fiber of their being. So if you look at the last sentence there, Margaret, hang on one second. The prophet's word is a scream in the night. While the world is at ease and asleep, the prophet feels the blast from heaven. So what he's talking about in the experience of prophets are people who can't sleep because the pain and the anguish of the injustices or the agonies that they perceive is so great that they can't understand how anyone is sleeping. Go ahead, Margaret, you had a thought.
Well, the prophet has to be someone who's doing something for the good, because there've got to be a lot of people who others follow and believe, and maybe they think that they got the word, and you have to separate it. So they're not really prophets, but some people think they are.
Yes, right? So, right, what's the difference between a regular prophet and a false prophet is something that occupies the attention of lots of people, right? For example, there was an enormous cataclysm in the 16th century with the promulgation of a false messiah, Shabtai Tzvi, who went around pretending he was the messiah, and then people realized actually no, and part of the clue was that he converted to Islam. Right? So that's a course for another time. Where do you see this? Okay, most prophets don't want to be prophets. Is the experience of being a prophet a joyous one?
That's Martin Luther King Jr.
Right? It's agonizing. Why is it so agonizing to be a prophet?
Because people don't believe you, they think you're crazy,
Okay, so part of it is because you're shunned and lonely, which is a piece of it, right? Because people don't get, why else is it so hard to be a prophet?
They suffer.
They suffer. Literally, their souls are aching in agony by the injustice they see out in the world. They can't take it. They just can't take it. And because they call people to account from their place of agony, as he says, a scream in the night, they're not really popular. Because who wants to hear it? How many of you know who Greta Thunberg is? Greta Thunberg is a Norwegian young lady who is on the spectrum. She has high functioning autism, who when she was 11 or 12 years old, read about what's going to happen with climate change on the account of a rising temperature on the planet, and said, what the hell is wrong with you people? You're destroying the planet, and you're the grown-ups. I'm 11 years old, 12, 13, whatever she was, right? And she couldn't stop screaming. And no one could stop screaming at her. She had to have bodyguards. And people yelled at her and screamed at her and made fun of her and threatened her life and all kinds of things, because as a teenager, she said, you're supposed to be the grown-ups and you're handing us a world that's going to be underwater. And you're not stopping to do anything about it. She couldn't stop screaming. She couldn't sleep. I'm not sure she's still sleeping, right? She's been at it for a decade now.
She was arrested twice yesterday.
That was just yesterday.
The Netherlands.
Just yesterday, right? So here's what Jeremiah and Ezekiel, this is an amalgamation of their experience. What did they say about being a prophet? Should be the day I was born. Better I shouldn't have been born, because the agony I'm carrying is so great. I'm upset that God didn't make me a stillborn. So my mother would have been my grave. Why did I come forth out of the womb to experience all this pain? They wish it didn't happen. Here's what Ezekiel said. Because at the same time, right, everyone's yelling and screaming at them. Because no one wants to hear it. So here's what Ezekiel says. Someone want to read Ezekiel? Anybody feeling a little mystical?
Read it.
Apparently no one's feeling mystical.
And you, son of man, be not afraid of them, or be afraid of their words. Though
Briars.
briars and thorns are with you and sit upon scorpions, be not afraid of their words, nor be dismayed by their looks.
Right, so Ezekiel hears God because Ezekiel doesn't really want to be living the life he's living. And he hears God say, you, human being, don't be afraid of those other people, and don't be afraid of what they're saying about you. Even though they're like sitting in briars in a thorn bush. And it's like you're sitting on a bunch of scorpions. Don't be afraid of them. Okay. Right, keep going, Susan.
Behold, I have made your face hard against their faces, and your forehead hard against their foreheads. The people also are impudent and stubborn. I send you to them, and you shall say to them, thus says the Lord God. And whether they hear or refuse to hear, they will know that there has been a prophet among them.
Right, so listen, I need you to buck up a little bit. I want you to go head to head with them. These naysayers and these people who are going to be throwing barbs at you. They're impudent and they're stubborn. And so I send you to them. And I want you to say, thus says the Lord God. And whether they listen or they don't listen, they'll at least know that truth was presented to them. Because ultimately, we as humanity, what makes us human?
Being able to think and
Being able to think and to feel. And in a couple weeks, we're going to have a whole week-long festival that is a celebration of freedom. Which means a truth is handed to you. What are you going to do with it? You can either follow it or you can chuck it. It's up to you, right? So if a prophet comes to you and says, what are you doing? You're destroying the world. You can either listen or not listen. You can either act or not act, but at least God's like, at least I know I sent you a prophet. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm just thinking on a bigger sense, is there a propensity for most of the population to live in denial, at least in the beginning, because it's uncomfortable to look at change or want to change or admit something? And people have an aversion to discomfort or to shift or to get out of their comfortable zones.
And also people have a hard time giving up power, right? So if I'm the king of the northern kingdom of Israel, and I have supplanted God's law with Canaanite law, which allows for the imposition of suffering on the vulnerable and the weak, and they say, hey, you need to give up some of your wealth and your power so these people don't starve. No one's real excited about that, right? The United States of America has decided that we are going to live in $1 trillion dissonance, right? What is our $1 trillion dissonance? We want the government to do this, and this. And we don't want to pay for it, right? Because if you go to people and you say, hey, in order for the government to do this, you need to pay 20% more in tax or we can't balance the budget. People are like, they'll make up all kinds of reasons why the government isn't doing it right. Except if it impacts the thing that you like, right? The road you want them to build, or the educational program you want them to fund, or Social Security, or Medicare, or whatever it is, right? So, or the strongest army in the world, or whatever it is that we think, right? telling people to give up is hard.
So are you saying that power rules?
I'm saying that what these people are trying to do is to try to tell people, you've got to change your ways.
Yeah.
And that starts with the powerful, but doesn't end with them. Okay? One thought and we'll go on one more.
So
Whoops.
supposedly I thought that God only spoke really to, Moses, a few people. Moses already, all early in the Old Testament. Do we feel our religion that we think these prophets have spoken to God?
So in the biblical mind, God speaks to these men, they're all men, there's a few women, Deborah and Huldah and a few others, but mostly men. That God they experience, and we'll talk about this in a moment, moments of epiphany, revelation, connection with that divine pathos, we'll talk about that. And then there's sort of an end to that period of prophecy, which sort of ends the Bible. And then you have the rabbinic period where they say, we don't hear God talk to us except through that text. And we're gonna have a dialogue with God through the text. But there were others that would say that over time and over a period, the same experience of prophecy that was had in this historic period, which is captured in the core text of our tradition, doesn't necessarily end there. It's not like all of a sudden God says, listen, I've got an appointment in another universe, I'll check in with y'all later. That's not how Heschel looks at the world. Heschel deeply believes in the idea that the reason why you need to listen to the prophets is because you need to cultivate within yourself the same posture to be open, at least to what a prophet says, or the prophets of your own time, even though it's not a position for which you can try out. It's a position that's occasioned by epiphany and grace. But you need to be open and sensitive so that when there are prophets in your midst, you listen. Whether it's modern day or ancient. Okay, let's take a look at just a couple more pieces. What is the primary content of prophetic experience? The thought immediately felt, the motive directly present to the prophet's mind. What are the facts of consciousness that stirred him so deeply? Is it a sense of anxiety about the fate and future of the people or of the state? An impulse of patriotism? Is it personal irritation at the violation of moral laws and standards? A spontaneous reaction of the conscience against that, is it more, what is going on in this prophet that propels him? Is it these sort of injustices or individual little catastrophes? What we hear, he writes, is not objective criticism or the cold proclamation of doom. It's not a legal formulation. The style of legal objective utterance is alien to the prophet. These are not general, criticisms of the world. He dwells upon God's inner motives, not only upon God's historical decisions. He discloses a divine pathos, not just a divine judgment. The pages of the prophetic writings are filled with echoes of divine love and disappointment, mercy and indignation. The God of Israel is never impersonal. What do you think he means when he writes that the prophet is dwelling on God's inner motives, not the historical decisions?
The inner motives makes the decision.
Okay. So give me an example of one of your inner motives. What propels you forward with life?
What propels me for what?
What propels you to do what you do in life?
Injustice.
Think about how you occupy your time.
I occupy my time by being with people who are in need. And my being with them makes a difference.
Mm-hmm. Good.
So I make sure that I do that with at least two people in my life.
You see people who are in need and you want to go be present for
I
them.
am there for them.
Okay, good.
There for them.
Someone
For
else?
them.
Yeah,
I'm focused on self-care these days. Not to be oblivious to others around me, but, you know, my whole life I cared for other people, now I'm focused on, especially as I age. So, I look at my spiritual health, my physical health, my emotional health, and I try to use my time in ways that nurture. But I also have a dual purpose. I want to connect, and I want whatever I do to have a positive impact on those around me.
yeah,
So this is a question, are we, human beings endowed with this, powerful, ability to sense the needs of others? When I was studying acupuncture, the people who had, been to school, the story was that she was so sensitive to the needs of others that when you were down the hall and she was in a room, she could sense the need of the patient.
she was that impact.
And so it always made me think about, are we born with it? I felt that it was something that God graced her with, rather than something that she learned. Although maybe she had a learning environment that helped, develop that further. But I was the only person that I have ever known who had this ability. And so a lot of what I hear here almost sounds like she could have been a prophet.
Could be, right? So I think part of.
Rabbi?
Yeah, Lois, go ahead. Sorry, I didn't see you.
Well, I seek out the company of people who are like-minded and care about the same community needs that I care about. So, it's basically, it's outside myself. That's what I'm looking for, those kinds of people that
Okay,
think the way I do.
good. I think part of what Heschel would say drives God is ahavat olam, an overwhelming sense of divine love. And it was that overwhelming sense of divine love that brought the world into being. In the same way that there is this overwhelming love that parents share that inspires them to bring another life into the world. If you've had the privilege of raising other lives, you know it is inconvenient to do so. They interfere with everything, and they are very expensive. And they take a ton of your time and your freedom and your life away. But you do it willingly. There are people who, when they can't bring life into the world, are in utter agony that they can't. And thank God that there are technological interventions now that allow them to be able to experience this. Right? So why do they do that? They do that because they're so overwhelmed with love that they feel bound to create. And then once that creation comes into being, you are so bound up with that creation that whatever happens to them happens to you. Hence the adage that one is only as happy as one's least happy child. Because you feel everything they do. Now, if you want to take that to a divine level, God feels what everybody feels all the time in every moment, infinitely more intensely than you feel the people you love the most. And what the prophet does is somehow channels that love and that attachment. The divine pathos is the key to inspired prophecy. God is involved in the life of humanity. A personal relationship binds God to Israel. There is an interweaving of the divine in the affairs of this nation. Not to the exclusion of every other nation, But we have a covenant with this God. The divine commandments are not recommendations, right? He's giving the finger to the Hebrew Union College there, right? But express divine concern, right? Why does God say honor your father and mother? Not just because it's a nice thing to do to call your mother on Sundays, but because this is what you're supposed to do, right? Because God is so concerned with what that mother is feeling and the vulnerability emotionally and spiritually and physically that a mother feels, that a kid at darn well better be there to attend to them. It's not just because it's nice. The reaction of the divine self, its manifestations in the form of love, mercy, disappointment, or anger, convey the profound intensity of the divine inwardness. So when a prophet says God is angry, it's because they think God is really angry. Because the insult, the pain that God is feeling evinces itself in anger, just like you. And when the prophet expresses disappointment, it's because they think God is really disappointed. Because God feels everything that we feel. Because we are in God. It is all around us. Our lives are not apart from that reality. Last thing I'll say here, and then we'll take last questions and conclude. The fundamental experience of the prophet is a fellowship with the feelings of God, a sympathy with the divine pathos, a communion with the divine consciousness which comes about through the prophet's reflection of or participation in the divine pathos. The typical prophetic state of mind is one of being taken up into the heart of the divine pathos. Sympathy is the prophet's answer to inspiration, the correlative to revelation. So the way that you know my computer is about to die, so Ron, if we can unshare me there, because I'm not sure that I can do that, my computer is gone. I'm not sure why that happened, but there it is. We may have lost Ron, so I may have to conclude a different way. Let's see if I can figure that out. There it goes. Thank you. The idea is that the way that your pathway is to revelation is to somehow be so deeply attuned to the wavelength that God's energy is passing through the universe that you and that wavelength are on exactly the same frequency. And through that is an overwhelming sense of appreciation for what's really happening in the world. And then the prophet has no choice but to respond from the very depth of his humanity, because his humanity is linked so tightly with God's pathos, with what it is to experience the world, that the injustices of the world assail the prophet so deeply they can't but scream and yell and cry and write what it is that they scream and yell and cry and write. Last thoughts, and then next week we'll see how this plays out in the writing of Hosea.
Rabbi.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to figure out if or where this statement and way of living fits in for me, maybe for others also. You know, sort of that feeling that it's out of my control. Like I'm able to live life more easily because I know that this is what it was meant to be. And I don't know if this fits in with just the prophets, with just God. I mean, I'm trying to think if it fits in anywhere, because it's a way of living that helps cope with, helps me cope with life and the what you deal with.
So I think that part of what the prophets are trying to teach is that if you follow the mitzvot and you live in accordance with God's teachings, then you're going to have a good holy life. And that's going to be your experience. You don't need to be a prophet. You just need to be in tune with what it is that God, and you know that this happens, right? When you're out of sync and the gears are grinding, right? And then there are moments where you feel like you're just like, life is just effortless because you're happy and you're fulfilled and you're making a difference when you're with Judy, as you said, like you're with the people who are vulnerable and you're giving of yourself and you walk away. Maybe you're physically tired, but you're emotionally energized because you just touched and plugged into that which is holy. That's what that's what the covenant is guiding us to experience for life. And the prophets are exploding with outrage when things are happening that deny people that, or when the injustice of the world seems overwhelming. There is no implication that says we should be prophetic. The implication is that we should listen to the prophets so that we live in accordance with what the Torah and the prophets are trying to convey.
Thank you.
Okay? We're still having fun? Just looking at these faces, it's sort of like, I don't know what I'm reading here.
Well, you read it, it's hard to read here, it's tough.
It is not easy to read him because he writes an extremely poetic style in his fourth language, which is kind of also hard, but that's also part of the fun of reading someone who in and of himself is somewhat prophetic. Enjoy the rest of your week. We'll see y'all next